welcome. You've made it here to a quiet space where time no longer asks for urgency and the world grows softer at the edges. Maybe you're already under the blanket. Maybe your eyes are just beginning to close. Or maybe your thoughts are still gently circling the day. Wherever you are, in body or in mind, this is your moment to drift. And tonight, we'll drift through something curious, something strangely familiar, something that vanishes even as we try to hold on. Have you ever forgotten something you swore you'd remember forever? A face that once made your heart race, a conversation that changed everything, a moment so full of color and meaning it felt impossible to lose. And yet, over time, it softened. The details faded. You reached back, and it wasn't quite there. Just the shadow of a feeling, just the echo of knowing you once knew. We often imagine forgetting as failure, a glitch in our design, a betrayal by the brain. But what if it isn't? What if forgetting isn't the opposite of remembering, but part of the same delicate dance? Tonight, we begin a journey not through memory itself, but through the spaces where memory slips, through the mechanisms that let us remember, and the reasons we sometimes don't. Imagine trying to replay an old song, but each time the melody returns a little differently. Memory is like that. It isn't a static recording. It's a living reconstruction. Each act of remembering is a new version of the original. You don't retrieve a memory, you recreate it. You don't press play on a fixed reel. You repaint from the bones of an old sketch. Neuroscientists call this the reconstructive nature of memory. The brain doesn't store experiences like files in a cabinet. Instead, it encodes fragments, sights, sounds, emotions, locations across different regions. When we recall, the brain pieces these fragments together like a puzzle, guided by context and emotion. And puzzles, as you know, don't always come back the same way twice. This might explain why memories change, why they blur around the edges, why we sometimes remember things that didn't happen or forget things that did. The more often we remember something, the more we reshape it, like a well-thumbed photograph that starts to wear down with every touch. And when we stop remembering, when we stop pulling the memory forward, the connections between those fragments begin to weaken. You've felt it, haven't you? That strange moment when you walk into a room and suddenly forget why you came in. The purpose was clear just seconds ago, but now it's vanished, as if stolen by the silence of the hallway. Psychologists call this the doorway effect. It's a subtle reminder that memory isn't just about what we know, but when and where we knew it. Context acts as a cue, and when that context shifts, even slightly, the retrieval process stumbles. So perhaps forgetting isn't a failure of memory, but a failure of access. Like a library book you know is there, but the catalog has lost track of it. You haven't burned the page, you've just lost the key to the shelf. Some researchers believe that many forgotten memories still reside in the brain, dormant, like seeds beneath snow, waiting for the right conditions to sprout again. At the heart of this system lies a small, seahorse-shaped structure in the brain called the hippocampus. It acts like a conductor, orchestrating the formation of episodic memories, the where, the when, the who. But the hippocampus doesn't work alone. It collaborates with the prefrontal cortex, which organizes and evaluates. It links with the amygdala, which colors memory with emotion, and together, The systems prioritize, associate, and store what we experience. Still, they are limited, and evolution, in its quiet wisdom, didn't build us to remember everything. It built us to remember enough, enough to survive, to learn, to connect. Forgetting in this light becomes a filter, a sculptor. It shapes the mass of experience into something manageable, something meaningful. It lets go of what doesn't serve. But that doesn't mean we're always comfortable with it, because memory does more than store facts. It sustains the story of who we are. When we forget, we don't just lose events, we lose threads of identity. If I can't recall what happened, am I still the person it happened to? And if I remember it differently each time, am I still the same person who lived it? Autobiographical memory, our inner timeline, is what creates continuity across years. But that timeline isn't linear. It warps, it folds. Some years stretch longer in our minds than others. Some moments feel close even when they're distant. This elasticity isn't random. It reflects how the brain weighs importance. Emotion, repetition, novelty. The things that shimmer more brightly are held more tightly. Others fade like chalk in the rain. And yet, even the brightest memories dim with time. Not because they are unimportant, but because time itself is a solvent. The strength of synaptic connections, the bridges between neurons, fades when not refreshed. Without use, even the strongest structures weaken. This isn't decay out of spite, it's efficiency. If the brain were to hold onto every detail, it would drown in its own data. So we forget, slowly, quietly, and in that forgetting, we become different versions of ourselves. Each year brings a slightly new narrator to the story of our life, one who chooses different highlights, remembers different lessons. Memory isn't a mirror, it's a lens, and that lens shifts with every passing day. This might sound unsettling, but there's something beautiful in it too. The idea that who we are is not fixed, but fluid, that our minds are not prisons of the past, but rivers of experience, always flowing, always reshaping, and within that flow, forgetting becomes not a loss, but a current. Still, one can't help but wonder, if memory is always moving, always reshaping, what happens to the memories we stop reaching for? When we stop reaching, the silence begins. Not a loud absence, not a slammed door, but a gradual quieting, like footsteps fading down a long hallway. The brain does not erase memories with urgency. It lets them dim, softly, subtly. And in that quiet, something curious happens. The neural paths that once sparked with familiarity grow cold, like winding trails no longer traveled. The grass returns. The footprints fade, not because the path was never there, but because we've chosen other roads since. This is the fragile art of retrieval. To remember something is not just to possess it, but to activate it, to summon the full architecture of a neural pattern from scattered regions of the brain and reassemble it into an experience we can momentarily relive. But that act requires a signal, a cue, a hint, like a scent drifting in that pulls you back to a long-forgotten room. Retrieval depends on access points. Without them, the memory itself becomes unreachable, though it may still exist in some form, dormant like seeds sealed in glass. Cognitive science shows us that retrieval is as crucial as storage. You may have encoded the memory perfectly well, but without the right trigger, you won't access it. That's why a song can make you weep without warning, why a certain street corner feels inexplicably familiar. These moments aren't just nostalgia, they're accidental activations, a flash of pattern recognition in a landscape of fading connections. Context is everything. We remember best when the conditions of recall resemble those of encoding. The same room, the same time of day, the same emotional state. This is known as state-dependent memory. It's why you may suddenly remember your grocery list only after returning to the kitchen, and why you might forget it entirely as soon as you step outside. The memory didn't vanish. The cue dissolved, and so the access collapsed. The hippocampus, that small seahorse-shaped sentinel, is deeply sensitive to context. It binds experience into cohesive episodes, not just what happened, but where, when, and under what emotional tone. Strip away the setting, and the scene can disappear. It's not that the memory was poorly encoded. It's that the key to unlock it has been misplaced. But even with the right cues, the passage of time takes its toll. Neural connections that aren't reactivated grow weaker. The proteins that form synapses degrade, and the patterns become harder to reconstruct. It's not a deliberate process. The brain isn't punishing you for forgetting your third-grade teacher's voice or the name of that park you used to visit as a child. It's economizing, freeing up space, protecting energy. Because memory is metabolically expensive, each recollection costs resources, and evolution tends to trim the fat. In many ways, this is how forgetting protects us. We do not need to recall the exact sequence of steps from every morning of last year. We do not need to keep the shape of every cloud we've ever noticed. Those memories fade not because they were meaningless, but because they were no longer useful. The brain prioritizes survival, clarity, and efficiency over sentimental fidelity. It lets go of what it deems unnecessary, whether or not our hearts agree. And yet, not all memories fade equally. Some remain vivid long after their relevance has expired. An awkward encounter at age 12. A compliment from someone we admired. A moment of fear under dim streetlight. These memories persist, not necessarily because they were more important, but because they were more emotionally charged. Emotion acts as a spotlight, searing the event into deeper neural grooves. The amygdala, our emotional signal booster, tags certain experiences with a kind of urgency, and those tags amplify the encoding. We don't just remember what happened, we remember how it felt. That's why emotional memories are so resilient, both joyful and traumatic ones. The brain gives them priority, but this also means that some memories are hard to forget, even when we wish they would fade. Not all forgetting is easy. Some memories return again and again, uninvited. They scratch at the surface in dreams, cling like smoke to fabric. These aren't accidents. They're consequences of how the system works, optimized for survival, not serenity. But what about the mundane things we forget without noticing? Where did you put your keys last Wednesday? What did you have for lunch 2 days ago? These memories vanish almost instantly unless they are tied to something meaningful or repeated. Without repetition, they're swept away like footprints on a windy beach. They were never meant to stay. Working memory held them just long enough for the task at hand and then discarded them as background noise. This process, too, is protective. Imagine if we remembered every detail of every moment, the color of every passing car, the precise configuration of clouds each morning, the facial expression of every stranger we've passed. Our minds would be flooded, unable to prioritize, unable to act. Forgetting creates mental clarity. It carves out the silence needed for insight, for focus, for rest. So forgetting is not just loss, it's refinement. A sculptor removing marble to reveal form. But if that's the case, if forgetting is part of how memory works, not a flaw but a function, then how do we explain those strange moments when a forgotten memory resurfaces suddenly, unexpectedly, triggered by something small, a smell, a breeze, a song? Where was it hiding? Was it truly forgotten or just sleeping? Studies in neuroimaging suggest that some forgotten memories can still provoke neural activity in the same regions that once encoded them, a kind of faint fingerprint, a shadow of the original. These shadows suggest that the memory was never entirely gone, just quiet, just waiting, which raises a haunting question. How much of us exists in that silence? How many moments, faces, places still linger somewhere, inaccessible but real? And if the self is built from memories, and memories can disappear or change or sleep, then is the self just as impermanent, just as conditional? Are we only ever the person we are able to remember being? Or is there more to identity than recollection? If we are not just what we remember, then what are we? Are we a continuity shaped by something deeper than recall, a kind of undercurrent, a presence that doesn't need names or dates to feel real? Or is the notion of self more like a narrative we stitch together, a story built from scraps of memory and guesswork, reinforced by repetition until it feels solid? Each time we say, "This is who I am," we draw from a handful of remembered experiences, the ones that survived forgetting, the ones polished by thought and softened by time. But what about the moments we no longer recall, the ones that once mattered and now float somewhere beneath awareness? Are they any less a part of us? The truth is, much of who we are was formed in moments we no longer consciously remember. The way you hold your breath when you're nervous, the way your voice tightens around certain names, the things you instinctively avoid. These are traces left by experiences that have faded, their content blurred, but their emotional shape etched deep. Our brains are built not just to remember, but to adapt, to take what was once known and shape it into behavior, reaction, instinct. So even when the memory is gone, the lesson may remain. This is the invisible side of memory, the kind that no longer surfaces in language or image, but still lives in the architecture of the mind. Procedural memories, implicit memories, the habits of emotion. These are the quiet ghosts of experience, shaping us from behind the curtain. You may not remember falling off your bike at age 4, but your body still flinches at the thought of fast corners. You may not recall the first time someone raised their voice at you in anger, but your muscles tighten when someone else does now. We remember without remembering. Autobiographical memory, on the other hand, is more fragile and more central to our sense of identity. It tells the story of us across time. It gives us a beginning, a middle, a sense of continuity, but it's also selective. Most people remember almost nothing from their first few years of life, a phenomenon known as childhood amnesia. And even after that, we retain only fragments. A birthday party here, a sudden injury there, a smell from the kitchen in late autumn. But most of the days, the ordinary ones, the in-between, are gone. not because they were unimportant, but because they didn't leave enough of a trace. The brain doesn't record time like a calendar. It records change, emotion, novelty, things that deviate from the norm. When life becomes repetitive, memory goes into low power mode. That's why a single vacation can feel longer in memory than months of routine. The brain marks the new, not the normal. And so, in looking back, we remember ourselves not by what was constant, but by what shifted. This has strange consequences. Our remembered self is not an average of all our days. It's a highlight reel, a curated sequence, a few peaks and valleys strung together by assumptions and stories. The person you think you were 5 years ago is based on what you remember about those years. But that picture is filtered, selective, sometimes distorted. We forget how often we were unsure, how long we waited, how quiet most days were. And yet, we build our identity from these fragments with surprising confidence. Cognitive psychologists have explored this sense of narrative identity, the idea that we form a coherent sense of self by weaving our memories into a story. This story doesn't need to be accurate, it needs to feel meaningful. And so, we smooth over contradictions, we fill in blanks, we reinterpret past events through the lens of the present. We make ourselves the protagonist. We assign causes and effects. We give ourselves direction, even if memory didn't provide it. And yet, this process is not always conscious. The brain constantly reshapes our memories to fit the story we believe. It's called memory reconsolidation. Each time we recall an event, we update it, not just with new details, but with new meaning. A conversation that once felt awkward might later seem insightful. A failure might be reframed as growth. The event doesn't change, but our relationship to it does. And in doing so, the memory itself shifts, not dramatically, but subtly, recolored, reframed. This is how memory and identity evolve together. As we change, our memories change with us. The brain preserves coherence, and so the past becomes more like a reflection, bending, adapting to the shape of who we are now. This isn't deception, it's survival, it's how we stay whole. But it does raise a gentle question. How much of what we remember is true, and how much is a version of truth that helped us live? We all have memories we tell often, stories from childhood, moments of transformation. Those stories gain weight not just from the event itself, but from the telling. The more we repeat them, the more real they feel. But repetition isn't preservation, it's construction. The brain strengthens certain pathways, weakens others. Eventually, the version we tell becomes the only version we know. Other details fall away. Contradictions are smoothed, and so memory becomes myth, a personal myth rooted in experience, shaped by need. This isn't good or bad, it simply is. The brain does not aim for perfect history, it aims for useful coherence, and in doing so, it allows us to move forward. But sometimes, this means we lose sight of how much has been lost, of how many selves we've been. The child who once feared the dark, the teenager who believed in impossible things, the person who loved someone and thought it would last forever. They're still part of us, but in fragments, faint sketches beneath the surface. And so we return to the quiet question that lingers beneath all forgetting. If we can no longer remember the person we once were, does that person still exist within us? Or have they drifted entirely into silence? And if they have drifted, those older versions of ourselves, stitched from forgotten mornings and long unspoken dreams. Then where did they go? If they are not dead, only silent, then what part of us keeps watch over them while we sleep? There is something about sleep that feels like memory's hidden twin, as if beneath the hush of dreams, some invisible process is deciding which parts of our past will make it into the next version of who we are. Every night, as we surrender to the softness of the pillow, a quiet sculptor begins their work, trimming, filing, rearranging the neural echoes of the day behind closed eyelids. Science tells us that sleep is not just rest, it is refinement, a necessary phase where the brain reshuffles memory traces, pruning what is unneeded and reinforcing what matters most. During sleep, particularly in the stages of slow wave and rapid eye movement cycles, the brain replays recent experiences. But it does so not with the aim of perfect recall. It edits, it evaluates, it preserves what serves and quietly releases the rest. In the stillness of dreams, forgetting takes its most graceful form. The hippocampus, that silent librarian of our episodic past, is busy while we sleep. During wakefulness, it receives and links together new experiences, packaging them loosely for later processing. But true consolidation, the embedding of those experiences into long-term memory, takes place during sleep. In slow-wave sleep, patterns of neuronal firing are replayed, almost like echoes of the day, reverberating one last time before they are stored elsewhere, mostly into the neocortex. It's as if the hippocampus is handing off responsibility, saying, "Here, this might be useful. Keep it safe." And if no such handoff occurs, if the pattern isn't deemed worthy or is never rehearsed, it quietly dissolves. Dreams often seem nonsensical, surreal, stitched together from fragments of places and people in combinations that never existed in waking life. But this is no accident. The brain isn't trying to recall, it's trying to reorganize. Sleep is a workshop, not a museum. Dreams may not be about remembering at all, but about clearing the space needed to remember better. And sometimes, in clearing, the brain chooses to forget. This process is not random. Sleep selectively favors emotionally significant memories, especially those connected to stress, fear, and novelty. Evolutionarily, this makes sense. Retaining lessons from danger or reward enhances survival. The amygdala, once again, steps in to amplify emotional salience, directing the sleeping brain to replay those experiences more frequently. Meanwhile, the emotionally neutral events, the walk to the grocery store, the dozens of unremarkable faces passed on the street, are quietly released. We wake up, often unaware of the memory work that has taken place. But something has shifted. We may feel clarity about an idea that was once vague. We may forget the tension of an argument that once felt sharp. Sometimes we remember less, but feel more at peace. Other times we remember more clearly, but without the sting. This is sleep's alchemy, not preserving memories as they are, but changing what they mean and how they feel. And yet, not all memories benefit equally. Chronic sleep deprivation disrupts this delicate process. Without sufficient deep sleep and REM cycles, memories are left poorly consolidated, or worse, overwritten. The hippocampus, overloaded with unprocessed information, begins to falter. Short-term memories are misfiled, and long-term memories become brittle. Over time, chronic fatigue doesn't just dull the body, it hollows the mind. Names slip, timelines blur, and the emotional clarity of events becomes muddled. The sculptor cannot work without stillness. Even more subtly, sleep affects our ability to suppress unwanted memories. The prefrontal cortex, which helps inhibit intrusive thoughts, relies on rest to maintain control. Without sleep, our defenses weaken. Traumatic memories become louder, more persistent. It becomes harder to distinguish between what should be remembered and what needs to be gently forgotten. In this sense, forgetting, healthy, adaptive forgetting, is not always an act of weakness. It's an act of curation. And sleep is the curator. Consider the metaphor of a garden. Each experience is a seed. Some grow wildly, others remain buried. Each night the gardener comes, tending quietly in the dark. Some branches are trimmed, others allowed to flourish. We awaken to a new landscape, unaware of how much has changed. We may not remember the work, but we benefit from its order. Without this tending, the garden becomes tangled, unmanageable. Sleep is not just rest, it is pruning, forgetting as a form of growth. But still, we return to a question that refuses to be pruned away. Who decides what stays and what is let go? Is it biology, cold and impartial, responding only to chemical signals and evolutionary programming? Or is there something deeper, something more personal, guiding the shears? Why do some memories, seemingly trivial, persist with vivid clarity, while others, more precious, are lost despite our longing? Sometimes we awaken with a memory we hadn't thought of in years, an old friend's laugh, a childhood toy, a scene from a book read long ago. It returns, not because we summoned it, but because the mind, in its quiet wandering, uncovered it again, as if something in the dream world brushed against it and brought it back to the surface. Is this randomness, or is it the unconscious mind whispering reminders of who we once were? These moments feel like gifts, not memories in the usual sense, but echoes from deep within the self. They remind us that forgetting is not always final, that memory, like sleep, follows rhythms beyond our control, and that perhaps, in the vast stillness of night, some forgotten part of us still stirs. But then, if sleep holds the power to both preserve and release, to decide silently what we carry forward, can we ever know what is truly gone? If we can't know what is truly gone, then perhaps we also can't fully know why certain things remain, why some memories cling tightly, curling into the folds of the mind like vines around stone, while others slip free no matter how hard we try to hold on. There are memories we revisit daily, and others we thought we'd never lose, moments filled with sharp joy or unbearable grief that now feel more like stories we once heard than things we actually lived. It seems intuitive to believe that the more important something is, the more likely we are to remember it. But the brain does not always align with our emotional sense of importance. Sometimes it remembers what was useful. Sometimes it remembers what was novel. And sometimes it forgets what we most wanted to preserve. Emotion plays a powerful role in shaping memory. Strong feelings, fear, excitement, shame, awe, act like a magnifying glass, intensifying the imprint an event leaves on the mind. The amygdala, a small almond-shaped cluster deep within the brain, helps determine which experiences should be tagged as significant. It collaborates closely with the hippocampus, enhancing the encoding of memories deemed emotionally salient. This is why we often remember where we were when something shocking happened, or how we felt in moments of great personal change. It's not that the emotion itself becomes the memory, but that it enhances the memory's depth, rooting it more firmly in our mental landscape. But emotional intensity doesn't guarantee preservation. In fact, when emotions become too overwhelming, they can interfere with memory formation entirely. Trauma, for instance, often fragments memory rather than securing it. The brain, flooded with stress hormones like cortisol, may become disoriented, its systems overwhelmed. In these moments, the encoding process falters, leaving behind fractured recollections, blank spaces, or distorted images. It's a paradox. The very moments that define us most may become the hardest to remember clearly. This is especially true for memories formed under threat. The body prioritizes survival in crisis. Attention narrows. Cognitive resources are diverted toward action, not reflection. And in the aftermath, what remains may be incomplete, not a full narrative, but a jagged emotional residue. Some people remember every sensory detail with painful clarity. Others recall almost nothing, just the lingering sense that something happened, something that changed them. Both responses are valid. Both reflect the way the brain tries, imperfectly, to protect us. And then there are moments we didn't realize were important until they were gone. A quiet walk, a casual conversation, a look exchanged and quickly forgotten. These don't feel meaningful at the time, and so the brain files them away loosely, if at all. But when circumstances change, when a loved one passes, or a chapter of life ends, we find ourselves grasping for those simple memories, desperate to feel close to something that once seemed permanent. And often we come up empty, because the brain didn't know to save them, because importance in that moment wasn't declared loudly enough. This reveals something quietly heartbreaking about how memory works. It responds not to what we will someday want, but to what we feel now. The encoding system is present focused. It makes decisions based on immediate relevance, not long-term significance. It doesn't anticipate nostalgia. It doesn't prepare for longing. So when we later discover that we miss something, a sound, a face, a feeling, it may be too late. The neural trace may already have faded beyond reach. And yet, there are memories that survive in unexpected ways. The warmth of a certain kind of sunlight, the sound of wind against a particular window, a scent, faint and unplaceable, that brings tears without explanation. These sensory fragments endure, sometimes long after the events they belong to have faded, because the sensory cortex, the part of the brain that processes smell, sound, touch, is closely connected to the limbic system, the emotional core. It means that even when we forget the facts, we may still carry the feeling. This is why memory is often triggered by the senses. Smell, in particular, has a direct route to the amygdala and hippocampus, bypassing more logical processing. A familiar scent can unlock a door we didn't know was there. It doesn't deliver a complete memory. More often, it delivers a mood, a sensation, a trace of who we were in a specific time and place. These moments don't always arrive with clarity, but they arrive with truth. And what about repetition? Repetition is another force that shapes what we remember. The brain strengthens connections each time a memory is recalled. Rehearsal reinforces structure. This is why we remember phone numbers we dialed often or routes we walked each day. But repetition doesn't always reflect importance. Sometimes we repeat the mundane because we must, and sometimes the most meaningful events are remembered only once and then never again. The brain, indifferent to our emotional attachments, saves what it finds frequent, not necessarily what we find sacred. But this isn't to say the brain is careless. It's adaptive. It must choose what to preserve in a world of overwhelming input. And so it chooses based on patterns, frequency, salience. It watches not for meaning, but for usefulness. And that difference between what matters to survival and what matters to the soul is the gap where forgetting quietly resides. Perhaps that is why we try so hard to create external memories. We take photos, keep journals, hold on to objects. We write, speak, record, repeat. It's not that we don't trust the mind. It's that we know it works on terms we can't control. We know it will forget what we meant to remember, and so we build scaffolding. We outsource memory into the physical world, hoping that when our minds forget, something else will remember for us. But no photo truly contains the moment. No sentence can fully hold a feeling. And so, even with these artifacts, we forget. Not entirely, but in pieces. The image stays, the words remain, but the essence of the moment, the breath, the laughter, the quiet ache, becomes something we feel only in glimpses. We touch the surface of the memory, but the depth is what we grieve. And still we wonder if even the most powerful memories can fade, if love, pain, joy, awe can all become dim over time. What exactly is it that survives? If not everything survives, if even the brightest experiences begin to flicker with time, then perhaps forgetting is not the enemy we assume it to be. Perhaps it is not a passive erosion, but an active, purposeful part of cognition woven into the fabric of how we think, how we adapt, how we live. It is tempting to view memory as a perfect archive, where forgetting is merely a crack in the system. But forgetting is not a crack. It is the scaffolding that holds the system up. Without it, the structure would collapse under the weight of its own detail. Imagine for a moment remembering every sound you heard today, every voice, every rustle of clothing, every background hum. Imagine retaining each glance, each item on a shelf, each fleeting impression from every conversation. Your mind would be crowded, cluttered, immobilized. Attention would falter. Decision-making would slow. To function is to forget. Forgetting clears the way for thought. It is not the breakdown of memory. It is memory's partner. Neuroscientists have studied this not as a philosophical idea, but as a biological truth. The brain has mechanisms that actively weaken or suppress memories over time. One such mechanism involves synaptic weakening. Neural connections, once formed, require reinforcement to remain strong. If a memory is not revisited, the synaptic links between the neurons involved in its pattern begin to degrade. This synaptic pruning is not accidental. It's a form of neural housekeeping, a reallocation of resources toward what is current, relevant, and used. This is the foundation of what psychologists call interference theory. The idea that forgetting often occurs not because a memory disappears, but because other memories disrupt or overwrite it. New experiences interfere with older ones. The more similar the memories are, the more likely they are to compete. Try recalling where you parked your car today, and now try to recall where you parked it a week ago. The newer memory obscures the older one, not by destroying it, but by taking its place in your limited field of retrieval. There is proactive interference, where old memories hinder the encoding of new ones, and retroactive interference, where new information clouds access to the old. This constant jostling of neural patterns is not a glitch, but a natural consequence of how the brain manages finite resources. We don't have unlimited capacity, and even if we did, the ability to retrieve would remain bounded by noise, complexity, and overlap. The brain curates, not perfectly, not always kindly, but with functional precision. Still, the result can feel disorienting. Have you ever had the experience of knowing something was once there, a fact, a name, a moment, but finding only a blank space when you reach for it? You know the memory existed. You may even remember remembering it. But now it's gone, not erased, just inaccessible. This gap between knowing and retrieving is called a retrieval failure. The memory trace might still exist, but without the proper cue, the brain cannot summon it. These retrieval gaps are especially common in everyday moments. You walk into a room and suddenly can't recall why. You see someone familiar but can't remember their name. You forget the word you were about to say, only for it to reappear hours later when you're no longer trying. These lapses are not signs of decay, but the natural rhythms of a brain filtering and rerouting. The pathways are still there, but they've dimmed or been covered by new growth. The loop has broken just long enough for the signal to miss its target. But even when memory fades, the brain rarely leaves us with complete silence. Instead, it offers placeholders, vague impressions, hunches, gut feelings. You might not remember the details of a past conversation, but you recall how it felt. Not what was said, but how their eyes softened, how your body relaxed. The emotional imprint remains long after the words dissolve. This is another way the brain manages forgetting, by retaining the shape even when it lets go of the specifics. Interestingly, the brain seems to value emotional coherence over factual accuracy. We remember how something fit into our understanding of ourselves more than we remember its precise features. If a memory contradicts our current identity, it is more likely to be suppressed, reshaped, or simply forgotten. This isn't manipulation, it's narrative maintenance. It's the brain ensuring that the story we live by continues to make sense, even if that means distorting the past to fit the present. And still, the forgetting doesn't feel like distortion. It feels like time. It feels like letting go of something you can't quite picture anymore, but that once felt real. A place you visited, but now can't map. A voice you once heard every day, now unreachable. These are not dramatic losses. They are gentle ones, a drift rather than a collapse. But they accumulate, and eventually we notice the distance between who we are and who we were, not as a sharp break, but as a soft fade. This is the slow forgetting, the kind that comes not from interference, but from disuse. The memories that are not called upon simply begin to fall away, not because they were unworthy, but because other memories rose in their place. The stream moves forward, and even when you try to look back, the water has changed. Still, sometimes we search. We close our eyes and try to summon a face, a scene, a sentence once spoken, and nothing comes. Or worse, something almost comes. A feeling hovers just beyond the edge of language, and that is the most haunting kind of forgetting. Not the absence, but the nearness. The knowledge that something once existed in you and now floats just beyond your grasp. If forgetting is part of remembering, if it is built into the very design of memory, then perhaps the better question is not why we forget, but why we remember at all. What is it about certain moments that grants them permanence? What is it about some experiences that allows them to survive the storm of interference, the erosion of time, the constant rewriting? What makes a memory indelible? If some memories fade because they weren't reinforced, or because newer ones press them out of reach, then what about the ones that stay, even when they're wrong? What about those recollections that feel as real as any others, but never actually happened? You remember the story, you see the details, you're sure of the outcome, but then something, a photograph, another person's version, an unexpected fact, reveals that your memory is false. It didn't happen that way, or perhaps it didn't happen at all. This is not rare. It is not pathological. It is not failure. It is the inevitable side effect of how memory works, not as a recording device, but as a reconstruction process. Every time we recall a memory, we rebuild it from pieces. We don't press play. We assemble a version, and in that act of assembly, new elements can enter. Old ones can shift. Our expectations fill in gaps. Our assumptions smooth inconsistencies. Over time, what began as a memory becomes a story, and then a belief. And belief has its own gravity. Psychologists have long studied this phenomenon, how people can develop vivid, confident memories of events that never occurred. In controlled experiments, researchers have successfully implanted false memories in participants by simply suggesting that certain things had happened in childhood: a lost trip to the mall, a spilled punch bowl at a wedding, an encounter with a dog. At first, participants deny the stories, but with repetition and reinforcement, many begin to remember them, visualizing details, describing feelings, even constructing dialogue. The memory becomes real, not through evidence, but through experience. This reveals something startling. Memory is not just fragile, it is imaginative. It is woven from threads of sensation, emotion, expectation, and narrative. And because the brain values coherence more than accuracy, it sometimes allows imagination to overwrite fact. Not maliciously, but adaptively. The goal is not to preserve history. The goal is to sustain a functional sense of self, to make sense of what has happened, even if the precise truth is lost. In daily life, this plays out constantly. We remember conversations differently from the people we had them with. We believe we said something we only thought. We assign motives, meanings, and consequences to past events that may not have existed in the moment. And we hold these recollections not loosely, but with conviction. Memory, once reconstructed, feels solid, even when it's a mirage. But if we can remember things that never happened, then what does it mean to trust our memories at all? Does this make them unreliable, unworthy of faith? Or does it simply make them human? Perhaps it's not about discarding memory, but learning to live with its imperfection, to understand that it is not a ledger, but a lens, a way of seeing the past, shaped by who we are in the present. This isn't always comfortable. Sometimes we are forced to confront the difference between what we remember and what others do, between what we're sure of and what actually occurred. And in those moments, it feels like something personal has been taken from us. a piece of ourselves called into question. But maybe the self is not defined by perfect recollection. Maybe it is defined by how we carry our memories, however flawed, and how we respond when they shift. The brain, after all, does not preserve memories for the sake of truth. It preserves them for guidance, for prediction, for context. If a memory helps you navigate the world, the brain holds on to it. If it confuses you, if it offers no functional value, it may be reshaped or discarded. This is why even inaccurate memories can be useful. They support the ongoing construction of meaning. They help us know how to act, what to expect, who to trust, what to fear. And sometimes, what the brain retains is not the memory itself, but the conclusion it supported. You may not recall the argument in detail, but you remember deciding not to trust someone again. You may forget the exact moment you fell in love, but you carry the certainty that you once did. These are summaries, distilled truths extracted from complex, fleeting events. And sometimes, the summary survives, even when the source material vanishes. The distinction between memory and belief begins to blur here. Belief, shaped by memory, also feeds back into it. If you believe something strongly enough for long enough, the memory will conform. The past is quietly rewritten to match the present narrative, not deliberately, not dishonestly, but gently, invisibly. The way stones in a river become smooth over time. Each passing thought reshapes the edges. This can lead us into dangerous territory. When collective memory becomes distorted, when entire groups remember history differently, or when myths replace facts, the consequences ripple outward. Wars have been fought over false memories, lives shaped by stories that were never quite true. And yet, these stories matter because what we believe about the past informs what we do in the present, and memory is belief's quiet architect. But not all false memories are grand or consequential. Many are small, harmless. You remember a detail from a movie that was never in the script. You're sure a street once had a tree that never stood there. These errors are not flaws. They are features of a brain that prioritizes efficiency over precision, a brain that fills in gaps so that the picture makes sense, a brain that wants the world to be complete, even if it has to imagine the missing pieces. And in this, there is a kind of tenderness. Memory is not a lie. It is a story told with limited material, a painting from sketches, a sculpture from fragments. Sometimes the result is accurate, sometimes it isn't, but it is always sincere, which leads us to a strange and quiet realization. We are, in many ways, made of stories, some true, some half-true, some remembered with clarity, some imagined into being, and we live inside these stories, trusting them, following them, building our lives around them. So if we are shaped by memory, and memory is shaped by imagination, then where exactly do we end, and where does invention begin? If imagination can shape memory, then what shapes memory before it even begins? Before there is anything to recall, there must be something noticed, something that captures awareness long enough to leave a trace. And yet, much of what passes through our eyes and ears never settles in our minds. It flows past, unmarked, not forgotten, but never truly remembered. The first step of memory is not storing, but attending. And in that step, more is lost than most of us realize. The mind is not a camera, and vision is not a recording. We believe we perceive everything around us, the faces, the voices, the scenes shifting at the edge of vision. but perception is filtered through the narrow tunnel of attention. Attention is not wide and constant. It is focused, selective, and fleeting. At any given moment, we attend to only a small fraction of the stimuli in our environment. The rest continues around us, unfelt, unclaimed, and what is not attended to is rarely encoded. This is why we sometimes fail to notice dramatic changes in our surroundings. In experiments on change blindness, people are shown scenes in which large elements disappear or shift from one frame to the next, and yet many fail to detect the change. A building vanishes, a person switches places, and still the viewer sees no difference. The reason is simple. The change occurred outside the spotlight of attention, and without attention, there is no memory trace. The experience passed through the senses, but never entered the self. Attention, then, is the gatekeeper. It determines what has a chance to be remembered. It determines what becomes part of our personal narrative and what is discarded in the moment it occurs. This is why distractions matter. This is why multitasking leaves us blank and fragmented. When our attention is split, memory suffers, not because the brain is lazy, but because it requires focus to encode deeply. It needs to dwell, to register, to connect. Even brief lapses in attention can lead to the absence of memory. You're reading a page and realize you've absorbed none of it. You reach for a cup of coffee and later can't recall whether you drank it. These moments feel like glitches, but they are simply the result of attention being elsewhere. The memory isn't missing. It was never formed. The brain was listening to something else, inside or out, and the experience was not invited to stay. This makes attention more than just a passive filter. It is an active sculptor. When we concentrate on something, when we are emotionally engaged or intellectually curious, the brain ramps up encoding processes. Neurotransmitters like dopamine and norepinephrine flood the system, enhancing synaptic plasticity, anchoring the moment more firmly in memory. But when we're bored, distracted, or overwhelmed, those same processes weaken. The memory never takes root. And yet, attention itself is limited. We cannot choose to attend to everything. The mind must decide moment by moment where to look and what to ignore. These decisions are influenced by countless factors: urgency, novelty, personal relevance, emotion, even habit. Sometimes we pay attention to the wrong things. Sometimes we fail to notice what we later wish we had seen. And in those failures, we lose not just a chance to remember, but the very possibility of it. That's why, later, we ask ourselves, how could I have missed it? How did I not see the signs? And the answer is almost always because you weren't looking, not in the sense of negligence, but in the sense of cognitive economy. The brain cannot attend to everything, and in choosing what matters now, it unknowingly sacrifices what we may need later. But attention is not just about the external world. It turns inward, too. We can choose to notice our own thoughts, our own feelings, or let them drift by unnoticed. When we reflect, we give weight to experience. When we pause and truly feel a moment, it sinks deeper into us. This is why mindfulness, the practice of sustained, non-judgmental attention, is so often linked to stronger memory and greater clarity. It is not about doing more. It is about noticing more, slowing down long enough for the mind to register that this right here matters. At the same time, attention can be distorted. Anxiety, for example, narrows attention. It locks the mind into a tunnel, amplifying threats and filtering out nuance. In these states, memory may become skewed, focused on danger, repetition, and urgency, while excluding calm or safety. The memory formed in such moments is not comprehensive. It is a slice, exaggerated by the emotional filter that was in place. And later, we may remember only the worst parts, not because they were the whole truth, but because they were all we attended to. This points to a deep and gentle truth. We do not remember reality as it was. We remember the part of it that we noticed. And noticing is never neutral. It is shaped by our moods, our biases, our goals, our fears. Memory begins not with the event, but with the gaze we cast upon it. And what happens when we stop casting that gaze? When we turn away, by choice or by distraction, from something we once cared about? The memory begins to dim, not because we no longer value it, but because we stopped feeding it attention, like a fire slowly cooling, like a room we stop visiting until the dust covers everything. So if memory depends on attention, and attention is always shifting, then forgetting becomes not a sudden loss, but the gentle consequence of inattention. We forget not with malice, not with effort, but simply by looking elsewhere, which makes one wonder, in a world full of noise, full of flashing signals and endless notifications, what else are we forgetting, simply because we never had the space to notice? And even when we do notice, even when a moment grabs hold of our full attention and imprints itself into the soft clay of our awareness, time still finds a way to soften its edges. It doesn't erase, not all at once. It smudges. It takes the sharp angles of memory and rounds them down until they no longer hurt, or no longer fit, or no longer stand out against the sea of what came after. Memory doesn't stay crisp, it weathers. And in that weathering, we begin to lose not just the facts, but the feel. What fades first is almost always the detail, the precise color of a shirt, the exact phrasing of a sentence, the order of events. These slip away gradually, almost respectfully, like guests having a party without disturbing anyone. The brain no longer finds those details useful, no longer revisits them, and so the synaptic traces weaken. They remain just long enough to leave a suggestion of shape, the outline of what was, but not long enough to survive unblurred. And yet, we often don't realize they're gone until we reach for them. You try to describe a memory, something important, something from years ago, and the scaffolding is still there. You know who was there, you know what happened, but as you speak, you realize the specifics are missing. You're filling in blanks without being aware of it. You're telling the story the way it's always been told, not the way it truly was. The image you hold isn't a photograph anymore. It's a painting that's been touched up so many times, you no longer remember what the original looked like. This erosion of detail over time isn't a flaw. It's an adaptation. The brain compresses information, storing the essence rather than the excess. It's a kind of memory compression, a summary algorithm that allows us to keep the core without needing to keep every component. You don't need to remember every time you drank tea on a cold morning. You need to remember that tea brings comfort when the world is gray. That's the pattern. That's the rule. The rest is ambient noise. But in losing the texture of a moment, something intangible slips away. A laugh you can't quite hear anymore. A smell you can almost name, the way someone's hand felt in yours before you both changed. These are the things that vanish without warning. And even though the memory remains, even though you can still describe the day, the scene, the sequence, it feels different. It feels thinner, more abstract, less like a moment lived, and more like a story inherited from a version of you that no longer exists. This is especially true for distant memories, those from childhood or early adulthood. When we revisit them, we often find they've become more symbolic than sensory. The texture is gone. What remains is meaning, distilled over time. The playground becomes a symbol of freedom. The schoolyard becomes a theater of identity. We no longer remember the grit of the slide, the smell of the classroom, the particular weight of our backpack. We remember the impression, the role it played in our becoming. Time strips away the detail, and in doing so, reveals the scaffolding underneath. And sometimes, what remains isn't even a memory of the event itself, but a memory of a memory, a recollection that's been recalled and reprocessed so many times it's become secondhand. You remember the photograph. You remember the way someone once described it. But the moment itself, that has been layered over too many times to find, and still, we treat it as real, because in a way, it is. The memory as it exists now is real, even if it no longer matches what truly occurred. And that version is the one we live by. The farther we move from an event in time, the more abstracted it becomes. Recent memories tend to be vivid, tied to specific contexts, but older ones float free of those anchors. They lose their timestamps. You may remember the event, but not the year, the place, but not the season. You lose the spatial and temporal coordinates, and what remains is a kind of impressionistic painting, color without contour, mood without metadata. This is temporal distance, and it affects not only what we recall, but how we feel about it. Emotional intensity, too, fades with time. What once felt unbearable may now feel remote. What once filled you with laughter may now bring only a gentle smile. The emotional signals that once carved deep grooves into your neural architecture begin to level out. The peaks soften, the valleys fill in, and the brain, ever pragmatic, adjusts the memory to match, not because the past has changed, but because you have. The memory conforms to your current state, your current self, and in doing so, becomes more palatable, more useful, less raw. This gradual fading helps us heal. It allows us to move on. It lets us tell stories that once hurt and now only ache. It gives us permission to reframe, to reinterpret, to find new meaning in old events. But it also complicates our relationship with the truth. Because as memories shift to fit the shape of who we are now, the question arises, is this how it happened? Or is this how I need to remember it so I can live with it? The brain does not answer this question. It does not care. Its concern is not with historical accuracy, but with coherence, with stability. And so it edits silently, reshaping the past to support the present, even if it means losing precision along the way. And the strange thing is, we often welcome this. We let the details slip. We soften the edges. We let time sand down what was too sharp, too bright, too much. But then, once in a while, something unexpected brings it back. A voice, a photograph, a scent, and suddenly the memory flares with detail, color, sound. For a brief moment, the erosion reverses. The clarity returns. And you are there again, not as a story, but as a presence. And just as quickly it fades again. Not because it was false, but because it takes energy to keep it whole. So maybe the fading isn't a failure. Maybe it's a mercy. The brain, recognizing that detail is heavy, chooses to let some of it go. But even as it does, the question lingers like the outline of a missing frame. If so much of memory fades into meaning, then what happens to the parts of the past that had no meaning at all? And if meaning is what memory tends to preserve, then what becomes of the meaningless, of the habits, reflexes, routines that seem to leave no emotional footprint, yet shape us just the same? We often think of memory as mental, something that happens in the mind, tied to thought, feeling, or image. But much of what we remember never becomes a thought at all. It lives in the body, quiet and enduring, beyond language and beyond forgetting in the usual sense. It does not tell us stories, it simply acts. You ride a bicycle years after your last attempt, and the motion returns, not as a remembered sequence of steps, but as a sensation, as muscle. You type without thinking of each key. You tie your shoelaces without recalling when you learned. These are procedural memories, implicit, automatic, embedded not in recollection, but in repetition. They are housed in regions like the basal ganglia and cerebellum, brain structures that specialize in pattern and rhythm. And they don't fade like episodic memories do. They outlast the narrative. They survive even when everything else is gone. This is why someone with severe memory loss, someone who cannot remember their own name, may still know how to play the piano. Why a person with advanced Alzheimer's may still move with grace through a familiar dance, their body remembering steps their mind can no longer name. It reveals something powerful and humbling, that memory is not confined to the conscious mind, that some part of us holds on even when awareness lets go. The body remembers in gestures, in posture, in tension, and relaxation. You flinch before your mind catches up. You take the long way around without knowing why. A smell makes your stomach tighten. A song slows your breathing. These are echoes of experience, stored not as thoughts, but as patterns of sensation. This kind of memory is not logical. It does not speak, but it guides us just the same. And yet, because it doesn't speak, we often don't recognize it as memory. We say we don't remember because we cannot summon an image or a name, but our body knows. It reacts. It avoids. It leans toward. There are scars in our muscles, in our breathing, in the way we move through rooms, scars we cannot see because they were never fully encoded as stories. They were encoded as responses. This is where memory and emotion become indistinguishable. A single encounter, barely noticed at the time, can leave a physical trace, a touch, a glance, a raised voice. We forget the moment, but carry its residue in our nervous system, in how tightly we hold our jaw, in how often we check the door. Trauma, especially, lodges itself in the body. It leaves behind hypervigilance, avoidance, physical symptoms that seem to float without origin. We forget the narrative, but the body refuses to release the lesson. Stay safe. Even positive experiences can imprint in this way. The calm that returns in a certain room, the steadiness in your hands when you hold a particular object. These are forms of safety remembered by the body, places of grounding that do not need to be understood to be felt. And they are just as durable, just as instructive, as any consciously recalled event. This embodied memory makes us who we are in a way that's difficult to articulate. It is our rhythm, our intuition, our deeply personal choreography. It is how we carry ourselves through the world, sometimes gracefully, sometimes guardedly, shaped by things we do not know we remember. And yet, this form of memory can also trap us, because when we don't recognize it as memory, we can't question it. We can't examine its origins or assess its accuracy. We may avoid situations without knowing why. We may react with fear or anger to cues we don't understand. The body is doing its job, remembering, protecting, but without the context of narrative, we are left confused by our own responses. We say, "I don't know why I feel this way," but the feeling persists. This is why healing often begins not with thinking, but with sensing, with returning to the body, with noticing where we hold our tension, where we brace, where we collapse. It is not a process of remembering in the traditional sense, but of listening, of allowing the body to speak in its own quiet language, and of trusting that what it remembers may matter even if we can't name the source. In this way, memory becomes a conversation, not just between past and present, but between mind and body. And it reminds us that forgetting does not always mean losing. Some memories are simply stored differently. They are less accessible to words, but no less real. And this expands our understanding of what memory truly is. It is not a file, not a recording, not a stack of images tucked into a drawer. It is a constellation of impressions stored in the muscles, the gut, the spine. It is the way you reach for the same mug each morning, the way your steps slow near a certain intersection, the way your shoulders rise when someone speaks your name in a particular tone. All of it memory, all of it alive. So when we say we've forgotten, we often mean we've forgotten how to access. Not that the experience is gone, but that it is no longer available to consciousness. It lives elsewhere now, in our gestures, in our patterns, in the pauses we take without knowing why. And that raises a quiet, unsettling question. If the body remembers what the mind forgets, then how much of us is shaped by memories we no longer know we hold? If the body can remember in silence, then what of the brain's silence by design? What if forgetting is not the slow decay we often imagine, but a mechanism precise and necessary, built into our biology from the start? We like to think of memory as a net, catching and holding everything it can. But there are times when the mind seems to cut its own threads, not out of failure, but out of purpose. And the closer we look, the more we begin to see that forgetting isn't just something that happens to us. It's something the brain actively does. For decades, scientists viewed forgetting as a byproduct, the inevitable fading of unused memories, like ink vanishing from an old page. But recent research reveals something more deliberate. The brain, it turns out, has systems that facilitate forgetting. Proteins and enzymes designed not to preserve, but to prune, cells that silence rather than amplify. And in this pruning, there is intelligence. The brain isn't simply discarding at random, it's editing. One such molecular player is known as PP1, a protein phosphatase that weakens synaptic strength. When activated, PP1 reduces the efficacy of connections between neurons, making them less likely to fire together in the future. In simple terms, it helps erase patterns that are no longer needed. And it's not alone. Other molecular systems, like the activation of specific microglia and receptor modulation pathways, work in concert to identify and remove irrelevant neural traces. This isn't damage, it's maintenance. This revelation reframes forgetting. It's not always the absence of memory, but the result of a decision, a quiet biochemical vote that this information no longer serves a purpose. Just as gardeners trim away overgrowth to let light reach the vital stems, the brain trims away memories that are redundant, outdated, or misaligned with current goals. This active forgetting keeps us flexible. It prevents cognitive overload. It allows new learning to happen in a system that doesn't cling to every trace of the past. And yet, because these processes are silent, we rarely notice them. We only notice the gap, the missing face, the absent reason, the strange feeling that something once vivid is now unreachable. But beneath that gap is structure, intention. The mind is making space, not falling apart. It is doing what it must to preserve focus, to reduce friction, to keep the self from becoming too crowded by ghosts. This doesn't mean forgetting always feels helpful. Often it hurts. We mourn the loss of moments that once lit us from within. We grasp at names that once danced easily on the tongue. We search for the rhythm of conversations that once meant everything. And when these things are gone, it feels like betrayal. But the brain isn't betraying us. It is saving us from drowning in a sea of accumulation. It is giving us room to breathe. There is something profoundly human in this process, the way the mind must let go to survive. It cannot carry every sorrow, every lesson, every version of us that once lived. It must choose, and sometimes those choices feel cruel, but often they are merciful, because not all memories are worth keeping. Not all wounds need to remain open. This becomes especially clear in the context of emotional regulation. Studies show that the brain is more likely to suppress or weaken memories that are distressing or contradictory to our current self-image. The prefrontal cortex, in collaboration with the hippocampus, plays a key role here, guiding what to retrieve and what to avoid. It's not always successful. Intrusive memories break through. But the general principle holds. Forgetting is part of mental hygiene. It is the brain's attempt to protect, to simplify, to steady the self. Even language reflects this wisdom. We say we're trying to forget something painful, but often what we mean is we're waiting for time and biology to do their work, to quiet the noise, to soften the sting, to file it all into a place where we don't have to see it every day. And sometimes it works, not all at once, not cleanly, but gradually. The memory becomes harder to access. The pain becomes less immediate. We don't lose the experience. We just stop living inside it. This isn't erasure, it's reshaping. Over time, the brain updates memories to reflect current beliefs and values. It smooths over rough transitions. It adjusts endings, not with lies, but with edits, like a writer refining a draft, not to distort the truth, but to make the story readable again. The memory may no longer be verbatim, but it's livable, it fits, and in some cases, the brain does more than edit. It buries. It puts memories in cold storage, not gone, but inaccessible. This is seen in dissociative amnesia, where people block out specific events, often traumatic, as a psychological defense. These memories may return unexpectedly, triggered by smell, sound, or emotional resonance. But until then, they are hidden, not destroyed, just shelved behind the curtain. It's a reminder that forgetting and remembering are not opposites, but points on a spectrum. That memory is not a switch, but a dimmer, and that sometimes the best thing the mind can do for us is to turn the volume down, to let silence grow where once there was static. So when we forget, perhaps we shouldn't panic. Perhaps we should pause, because behind that forgetting might be an act of wisdom, a biological choice made in our favor. Not because the moment didn't matter, but because we matter more. Because the space we need now is more valuable than the memory we used to hold. And still, we are left wondering if forgetting protects us, if it is part of how we stay whole, then how do we know what was meant to be kept? If forgetting is essential for the individual mind to stay balanced, then what happens when entire societies forget? When the memory of a culture, a people, a generation begins to dissolve, what fills the space left behind? We don't often think of memory as something that stretches beyond the self, but collective memory, the shared recollections of events, values, and traumas, shapes the world as much as any personal thought. It tells us who we are as a people. It defines belonging. It governs how we understand where we came from and where we believe we are going. And yet, just like personal memory, it fades, it changes, it can be rewritten, or it can vanish altogether. A society, like a brain, has its own processes for remembering. History books, oral traditions, monuments, rituals. These are its hippocampus and cortex. They encode what must be passed on. They preserve the narrative. But what a society chooses to record, and what it chooses not to, reveals its values. And sometimes, what is forgotten is not an accident, but an erasure, an effort to reshape the past, to protect the present, or more troublingly, to justify it. We call it revisionism when history is changed to suit political or ideological needs. But revision is not always deliberate. Sometimes it's slow. Cultural forgetting happens through neglect, through disinterest, through the natural tendency to simplify what was once complex. Over time, names are lost, events are blurred, causes are flattened. The nuances of history are smoothed away until all that remains is a vague story, repeated without question. And just like in personal memory, that story becomes reality, not because it is complete, but because it is the version that survived. Generational forgetting is a quieter kind, not forced, but inherited. One generation lives through something enormous: war, revolution, displacement. The next inherits the silence, not the memory. The stories aren't told, so the pain is too heavy. And so the experiences fade, passed down not as tales, but as shadows. A fear of certain places, a silence around certain dates, traditions kept without origin. The body of a culture remembers, even when the words are gone. This happens in families too. There are things not talked about, photographs never explained, names never mentioned. Children grow up sensing gaps they cannot name, feeling the presence of absence. And often, they carry that absence with them, reenacting patterns they do not understand. Forgetting becomes part of the inheritance, and so too does the search for what was lost. But forgetting can also be a tool for healing, a way for societies to begin again. After conflict, after collapse, after the unbearable, some things are left behind not out of denial, but out of need. Rituals of mourning, ceremonies of closure, these help communities release what cannot be lived with every day. The memory is not destroyed, it is held elsewhere, visited with care. Forgetting becomes a form of survival. Still, there is risk in forgetting too well. When we forget injustice, we repeat it. When we forget suffering, we cease to recognize its signs. History, left unremembered, does not stay neutral. It decays into myth or into silence. And silence has a shape. It protects those in power and erases those who were harmed. This is the danger of forgetting on a grand scale. It allows us to believe things were better than they were, or worse, that they were never different at all. We see this in the way historical events are taught, in which names are emphasized and which are omitted. We see it in the buildings that are preserved and the ones that are quietly demolished. We see it in the language of headlines, in anniversaries celebrated or ignored. Memory is not just content, it is curation, and those who control the curation shape the identity of the collective. But just as memory can be suppressed, it can also return. Sometimes all it takes is a voice, a survivor speaking, a document uncovered, a ritual revived. Collective memory can be reawakened, pieced back together from fragments, not always completely, not always without pain, but enough to say, this happened, we remember now. And in remembering, we see differently. The digital age has complicated this further. Now everything seems preserved. Every post, every image, every recorded word. But volume is not memory. In a world where everything is stored, the ability to forget becomes rare. The result is a kind of overwhelming noise, where the meaningful is drowned out by the trivial. Collective memory requires focus, not just access. It requires framing, storytelling, context. Without these, we don't remember more. We simply remember without depth. And so societies, like individuals, must choose what to carry forward. They must decide what to commemorate and what to let rest. The balance is delicate. Too much forgetting, and we lose our roots. Too much remembering, and we are paralyzed by the weight of what was. The art lies in knowing what deserves space and how to hold it without letting it define us entirely. In this way, forgetting and remembering are again revealed to be a pair, not enemies, but collaborators. One keeps the other from becoming unbearable. One makes the other matter. A society that remembers everything forgets how to move forward. A society that forgets everything forgets why it exists. So we teach history. We tell stories. We mark the anniversaries of both triumph and tragedy, not because we want to live in the past, but because we want the past to live meaningfully in us. Because the more we remember together, the more human we become. But even as we do, the question lingers. How do we recognize the parts of our shared past that have already slipped beyond the reach of stories, the memories that no one living remembers? And if we cannot remember what no one has passed down, if we cannot retrieve what has dissolved into the silence of generations, then the opposite must also be true, that some memories cannot be lost, no matter how much we wish they would fade. They cling to us, not as chosen companions, but as ghosts that won't take their leave. They surface uninvited, their presence disproportionate to the present moment, returning again and again until they seem to shape the very fabric of daily life. These are the memories that do not dim, that resist forgetting, and they are often born from pain. There are experiences so charged, so destabilizing, that the brain doesn't process them like ordinary events. It doesn't file them away neatly. Instead, It stores them in fragments, intense, sensory heavy, emotionally raw. These fragments may not form a coherent story, but they persist in the quiet hours, in dreams, in flashes that come without warning. This is the architecture of trauma. Not just what happened, but how the brain couldn't make sense of it, couldn't encode it cleanly. So instead, it left the memory jagged, and jagged things tend to snag. Post-traumatic stress disorder is one form of this persistent remembering. A disorder of memory not because the memory is gone, but because it refuses to settle. The amygdala, hyperactive and alert, flags the traumatic memory as urgent, again and again, even when the danger has passed. The hippocampus, which should place the memory in the past, struggles to anchor it, and the prefrontal cortex, responsible for regulation and reinterpretation, becomes overwhelmed. The result is a loop, a return to pain, not because one chooses to remember, but because the memory never properly arrived. These memories are not whole. They are often incomplete, sensory-driven, stripped of narrative logic. A smell becomes unbearable. A certain sound triggers panic. The brain cannot contextualize these signals, and so it prepares for danger. Again and again, trauma memory is not just recollection, it is re-experiencing. The past invades the present, bypassing conscious thought. This form of memory does not erode with time in the way other memories do. In fact, it can become more entrenched, especially when reactivated repeatedly. Each time the loop completes, each flashback, each panic response, the brain strengthens the network, reinforcing the very connections it needs to dissolve. It is a cruel paradox. The more you relive it, the harder it is to let go. And yet, healing is possible. It often begins with telling the story, not as it feels, but as it happened. Integrating fragmented memories into coherent narratives allows the brain to begin reprocessing. Therapy, particularly forms like EMDR or trauma-focused CBT, helps guide the mind toward resolution. It teaches the brain to revisit without reliving, to remember without being overwhelmed. It's not about forgetting the trauma. It's about giving it context and thereby reducing its power. Still, even with care and time, some memories refuse to leave entirely. They soften, perhaps, they grow less sharp, but they remain, embedded not just in the brain, but in the body, in tension patterns, in avoidance, in instinct. Trauma is not merely a memory of what happened. It is a shift in how the nervous system perceives the world. Afterward, safety becomes suspect. Calm feels unfamiliar. The body stays on guard. Forgetting in this context becomes not just desirable, but deeply longed for, yet elusive. This is why people sometimes seek oblivion through substances, distraction, repression, not because they want to forget everything, but because they need one memory, just one, to loosen its grip. And when it won't, they try to dull the system that keeps it alive. These are not acts of weakness. They are survival strategies. The brain, when overloaded by memory it cannot process, seeks escape any way it can. But forgetting isn't simply the absence of memory. It is a process, and some memories sit outside that process. They are too large, too emotionally charged, or too rehearsed. They exist on a different timeline, not faded, but stuck. And this stuckness can distort everything that comes after. A single, unresolved memory can alter how a person sees themselves, others, and the world. It can make the present feel like a repetition of the past, even when nothing around them has remained the same. In this way, memory becomes less about what we recall and more about what we inhabit. Trauma that is not integrated becomes a lens, coloring new experiences before they fully arrive. We remember pain where there is none. We expect loss before there is threat. The past is not just behind us, it is beneath us, shaping the ground we walk on. And because it cannot be forgotten, it must be faced. Yet for all its weight, this kind of memory is still a form of the mind trying to protect itself. It replays what hurt because it believes it must remain vigilant. It keeps the pain alive because it fears being unprepared again. And once we understand that, we can begin to respond with compassion, not by trying to force forgetting, but by guiding memory toward peace, toward integration, toward acknowledgement without paralysis. There is something deeply human in this, in the longing to forget what cannot be forgotten, in the effort to carry a memory that still trembles in the hands, and even in the quiet victories, the moments when the memory comes and goes without ruining the day, there is a kind of healing, not by erasing the past, but by making room for the present to exist beside it. So perhaps the goal is not forgetting, but learning how to live with what we remember, not to silence memory, but to soften its edges, to remind ourselves that the worst things that happen to us are not the only things that define us, that even if a memory never fades, it can change shape. And yet we still wonder, when memory refuses to dim, when it stays too loud for too long, how do we ever know that we've moved on? If some memories refuse to fade, circling our minds long after we wish they'd let go, then others are released too easily, not because the brain discards them, but because we never asked it to hold them in the first place. We have become so accustomed to storing outside ourselves, in phones, in servers, in clouds suspended over networks we cannot see, that our minds no longer bear the full burden of remembering. It is a convenience, a miracle even, but perhaps also a quiet trade, one that shifts the balance between what we remember, what we forget, and what we never really knew. In a world saturated with digital memory, forgetting feels almost obsolete. Every conversation, every photo, every transaction is archived automatically. We no longer need to remember a friend's phone number, the date of an appointment, or even the face of someone we met once and never saw again, because somewhere an algorithm holds it for us. Memory has become searchable, instantly retrievable, perfect in detail. But memory, as it lives in the brain, was never built to be perfect. And in outsourcing it, we've begun to change not just how we remember, but what remembering means. This phenomenon has a name, the Google effect, or digital amnesia. Studies have shown that when people know information is stored externally and easily accessible, they are less likely to retain it themselves. The mind, ever efficient, adapts. Why hold on to what you can retrieve with a few taps? The brain doesn't waste energy on redundancy. It lets go, not out of failure, but out of faith that the system will hold what it no longer does. And yet, what we retrieve from devices is not memory in the true sense. It is data, facts, captured images. What's missing is the texture, the emotional weight, the context, the layered associations that only internal memory provides. You may scroll through thousands of photos from past years and still feel oddly untouched, as if looking through someone else's eyes. The details are preserved, but the meaning, That comes from something memory once did and now does less often: connect. Real memory is relational. It links moments together. It allows us to see change, to feel distance, to trace the arc of who we've been. When we no longer rehearse memories, when we no longer tell the stories, revisit them, let them grow or fade naturally, we risk losing that thread. External storage gives us infinite recall, but at the cost of depth. We can access anything, but nothing anchors. This isn't just a shift in capacity, it's a shift in responsibility. The act of remembering once required effort, intention, presence. Now remembering has become passive. You're reminded by a notification. A memory appears on your screen. A machine tells you what you once did, where you once were, but you did not seek it. You did not relive it. It was shown to you as an artifact, a reflection, not a return. And because of this, forgetting changes too. It becomes harder to forget intentionally. We used to release memories through absence, by no longer visiting a place, by letting time dissolve the image. Now reminders persist, tagged in a photo you didn't want to see. A past event resurfaced by an algorithm that doesn't understand grief or closure. The digital world does not forget unless we ask it to. And even then, deletion is never guaranteed. In this landscape, memory becomes something curated by forces outside our control. We are prompted to remember what systems deem significant, and we are left to forget not what fades, but what is buried by the flood of everything else. This is a new kind of forgetting, one of overcrowding, of distraction. We forget not because we lose access, but because we are overwhelmed by access. Too much to hold, too much to feel. And so we scroll past it all, skimming the surface of our own history without time to sink. Even our sense of identity begins to shift. In the past, memory helped ground the self, a fluid but coherent record of becoming. Now, the self is scattered across timelines, across platforms, across uncountable data points. Who we were is not remembered by us alone. It is remembered by systems, tracked, time-stamped, translated into metrics. We do not forget so much as we are forgotten by our own attention. And yet, we still long for real memory, for the kind that lives in conversation, in smell, in touch. The kind that doesn't just show us where we were, but reminds us who we were. This kind of remembering cannot be backed up or synced. It must be lived, rehearsed, held in silence. It is slower, softer, but it is the memory that changes us. Perhaps this is why we now return to old habits, writing journals again, printing photographs, holding on to objects that seem to carry weight. We crave physical presence in an age of digital replication. We crave memories that fade naturally, shaped by time and feeling, not by code. We crave the right to forget gently, not because a platform deleted us, but because a part of us no longer needs to hold so tightly. So the question now is not whether we remember too much or too little. It is what kind of remembering we are doing, and what kind of forgetting we have lost. In trying to preserve everything, we may be leaving no room for meaning. In giving memory to machines, we may be giving up part of ourselves. And that leads us to wonder, if we no longer forget the way we once did, then what happens to the peace that used to come with letting something slip away? If we no longer forget the way we once did, then perhaps we've lost something deeper than silence. Maybe we've lost the comfort of vanishing, the grace of not knowing, the gentle unraveling of a moment that no longer insists on being held. Once forgetting was part of the rhythm of life, a soft ebb after the tide of remembering. Now we seem caught in a flood that refuses to recede, surrounded by fragments we once hoped to preserve, and others we silently begged to dissolve. But forgetting, real forgetting, still happens. It slips in beneath our conscious habits, behind our screens, beneath our storage. It happens in the pauses between thoughts, in the fading of a name, in the way we look at something once familiar and realize it no longer stirs the same feeling. And when it comes, it asks nothing. It doesn't argue. It doesn't ask permission. It just begins, slowly, quietly, without drama or sound. Sometimes forgetting is a gift, a mercy wrapped in dust. It softens the harshness of a fight long past. It removes the sting from a sentence we once replayed over and over. It lets us remember someone's smile without the weight of how it ended. It allows love to remain, even if the form it once took is gone. Forgetting is how we learn to breathe again when remembering becomes too heavy. But forgetting isn't always kind. It steals too. It takes faces from us, places, laughter. Whole seasons of our lives can become blurry impressions, as if someone dimmed the lights and lowered the volume on entire chapters. And we don't always know they're gone until we try to recall them and find only a quiet where something used to live. Even so, forgetting remains part of how we move forward. It allows space for new things to form, for new stories to take shape. If memory is what roots us, forgetting is what unroots us, just enough to keep growing. The balance shifts. Too much memory, and we are burdened. Too much forgetting, and we are lost. But between the two, in that soft, trembling line, there is movement, becoming, changed. And perhaps that is the point. Not to remember everything, nor to forget everything, but to allow what we remember to shift. To understand that we are always editing the past through the lens of now, and to forgive ourselves for the details we no longer hold, for the names that slip away, for the softness of something once sharp. Because in the end, no one remembers perfectly. We all live in partial recall, in a mosaic of impressions and echoes. Sometimes we try to hold on too tightly. We reread old messages, revisit photos, repeat names in our heads like mantras. But memory does not obey force. It is not something we keep so much as something we host. It comes and goes. It deepens and recedes. It cannot be frozen. And when we try, it loses something essential, the pulse, the breath, the warmth of a living thing. So we let it live, and we let it leave. Sometimes we do both in the same breath. And still, forgetting isn't absence, it's a change in presence. It is not that the memory is gone, but that it no longer steps forward. It no longer insists. It drifts into the background, content to rest. And we too must rest. We must let the mind clear its spaces. Let it place certain things back on the shelf. Let the stories we've carried settle, no longer sharp-edged or loud, but quiet, weightless, folded. Because what we forget is not always lost. It may return in a dream, or a scent, or the shape of a shadow falling across the wall just so. It may not announce itself. It may not even be noticed. But for a moment, we will feel the pull of something familiar, something that once mattered, and in that breath, even without naming it, we will remember that we once remembered. And in the spaces between memory and forgetting, there is a kind of freedom, the kind that lets us sleep, the kind that lets us soften, the kind that lets the past be what it was without asking it to explain itself again. So as you lie here now, eyes heavy, thoughts loosening their grip, you do not need to remember everything. You do not need to hold it all. Let some things drift. Let them dissolve. Let forgetting be not a loss, but a letting go. Because in that letting go, you are making room, not just for rest, but for all the quiet things the mind remembers when it is no longer trying to. And perhaps, as sleep comes near, you'll feel it. Not a memory, not a forgetting, but something in between. A stillness that asks nothing, yet holds everything you've ever been. A soft place where you don't have to know, only drift.